This is a practice for developing acceptance. You don't need many props for this one. A nice thick blanket will be almost necessary. A yoga block could be very helpful as well. And if you're someone who tends to have shoulders that are a little stiffer, I would encourage you to maybe grab a couple of bed pillows or a bolster, and I'll give you some options on how you might use that a little bit later in your practice. Now go ahead and place your yoga block and your blanket all the way up past the top of your mat. We'll use those in a little bit, okay? I'll have you come to your hands and your knees with your head pointed toward the top of your mat, that is toward your block and your blanket. And step your knees out about as wide as your mat and bring your big toes together. Bring your elbows down to the mat and use your elbows to push your hips toward your heels. Will your hips touch your heels? No. No. But if they're way up high, then I'd like for you to stack up your hands so you have something to rest your forehead on. If your hips come back nicely and you don't feel like it's a lot of effort to hold this backward position, then you're welcome to bring your forehead all the way down onto the mat. And if you're not using your arms to support your forehead, go ahead and send your arms out long toward the front of the mat. In the child's pose, the emphasis is on moving backward. So if you feel like you're really getting jammed forward into your neck and your head, then you might want to take that blanket and just put it under your chest, so that there's some sense of being able to surrender to the back of the mat. And once you have your position in your child's pose established, start to lengthen out the inhales and the exhales. A little bit more time. Just stretching those breaths out. Though not necessarily increasing the volume of the breath. And then begin to chant in your mind, mentally, a mantra. As you breathe in, I am breathing in. I am breathing out. Continue just like that. On the inhale, I am breathing in. I am breathing out. Now you may need to recite your mantra a little more slowly or a little more quickly, based on the pattern of your breath. Notice how the body shifts, almost recreates itself with every breath. Let's take 2 more breaths in your child's pose. I am breathing in. I am breathing out. And then press forward up onto your elbows again. And walk yourself out onto your belly. So you're almost like in a sphinx position. So you're propped up on your elbows, just briefly here. Your legs are stretched out long behind you. And you have a blanket and a block in front of you, which you have conveniently placed for later use. We'll make use of one, maybe both of those now. So the blanket, if you're using it, has to be really thick. So roll it up nice and thick. And then the left palm needs to plant on the floor, maybe just slightly to the outside of the left side of the blanket. Push down into that left hand so your elbow lifts away from the floor, and then just thread your right arm under your left. And with your left shoulder, move straight down toward the mat. So when you come down and rest your forehead on your blanket, your right arm is kind of pinned under you. If you are a person with boobs, your arm is sort of between your chin and your boobs. And this is kind of a big stretch on the outside of the shoulder, right? So if you need to have your forehead a little bit more lifted, maybe the block is a better choice for you. That's why we put it there. If this is not even remotely tolerable, even with something under your forehead, this is where one of those pillows or the bolster could come in handy. You would just slide it under your low chest, belly, and hips. And then let your arm just kind of hang out in the channel between the pillow or bolster and the blanket that your head is resting on. The left arm is just hanging out, just resting maybe to the left. I'd probably keep it bent. I am breathing in. I am breathing out. And as you're breathing in, I'd like for you to identify some small suffering in your life. So for example, it could be that your shoulder is a little uncomfortable in this pose, right? So maybe that's the small suffering that you acknowledge. Or maybe it's that you're a little busier than you want to be. Or perhaps you feel unappreciated at home or at work or both. As you breathe in, pull that small suffering in. Do it again. As you breathe in, inhale that small suffering, take it inside. Notice if there's any resistance to it, if you're holding or tightening up or squeezing. Try not to. Take it in, soften as you acknowledge. Notice how I did not ask for you to release that suffering on your exhale. Please don't. Just take it in. Notice that once you bring it in, it's not as heavy and dark. It's not as dense. It actually feels kind of spacious once it's inside. One more breath. One more acknowledging. And then you'll plant the left hand. Plant it on the floor so that you can really use it. You can push down into it. Because I'm going to have you push down into that left hand to lift up your head and shoulders and roll onto your right side with your head just resting on that same surface that your forehead was resting on before, except for now the side of your head is resting on the surface. And your right arm is stretched out in front of you. And you see what it feels like to take that in, to acknowledge that suffering, to accept it, now that you're on your side and you're not so squished. Just some small suffering. And while it's true that many of us could find some big sufferings, maybe now isn't exactly the time for those. So let's try with something that's not quite so big, something easy. Maybe no one in your family ever does the dishes, right? Or you never have enough hot water for your shower, something like that. And then continue to kind of shimmy yourself to the right. So you're going to kind of move your upper body, your knees, your head all a little bit to the right side of the mat so that when you roll onto your back, you're going to be right there in the middle of the mat, and then either get rid of the surface that your head was resting on or make it much, much, much lower, much thinner, okay? And once you're on your back, push down into your feet and lift your hips and shift them over to the right. So your shoulders are kind of in the center of the mat. Your feet are in the center, but your hips are to the right. And then draw your two knees up in towards your chest before you tilt all the way to the left and drop your legs to the left. Try to have your feet not too close to your butt. And if you'd like, you can place that extra block or blanket between your knees or your shins or your ankles, whatever feels best for you, if they're not exactly together, which they're not always. The right arm is going to stretch out to the right. Left hand you could use maybe to rest on top of the right thigh, but you don't have to. Turn your face to the left. Turn your face to the left. And as you breathe in, you acknowledge that small suffering that you've already identified. Or maybe you've got another one you want to work with. Pull it into you, see where it goes. So often in our culture, we are told, admonished, instructed that any kind of suffering is unacceptable. So when you go to a trusted authority as a child and you have something that's maybe bothering you, maybe somebody stole your toy, and that authority figure often says something like, don't be mad. Or maybe something happened at school when you were a kid and it was really upsetting. You told a friend, a teacher, a parent, and they say, don't be sad. This really sets us up to believe that our suffering is not acceptable. There's no time for it. There's no place for it. The only thing you do with suffering is let it go. Use these next 3 breaths to just softly breathe that in. Acknowledge that thing. And acknowledge any feelings that come up around it. Maybe it feels good to finally just accept it. Or maybe it makes you a little upset. That's okay. It's okay. Let's take one more breath now in the supine twist. And if there was anything between your 2 legs, just shift it back up to the top of the mat in case you want to use it again. And bring your toes back onto the mat and then your feet so that you can shift your hips way over to the right now. so that when you roll onto your left side and then to your belly, you're not way off of your mat. You don't have to make a big correction, just a little correction. And as you come up to a little bit of a sphinx position, very informal, let's go ahead and set up your blanket again so it's nice and thick. If you're using your blanket, or get your block ready for your forehead if you're using your block. And so this time the right palm is going to be flat on the mat all the way to that right corner. You'll push down into the right palm so your elbow can rise away from the mat. And then thread your left arm under this time and bring your right shoulder down as faster than your left shoulder toward the mat. Let that right arm remain bent, the elbow, the wrist, the palm just resting softly on the floor in a position that feels really neutral for you. And the forehead on that surface, hopefully very comfortable for you. I am breathing in this suffering of mine. To me, the first step in compassion is recognizing the right of something to exist. And so to lack compassion then would be to refute something, to deny something's right to exist. Your suffering has a right to exist. Indeed, as the Buddha says, suffering is inevitable. It is embedded in the human experience to suffer. So it's not wrong for you to suffer, even if it's something tiny. Even if it's something that is of your own doing. Your suffering exists. It has a right to exist. And right now you acknowledge it. I am suffering. This is a moment of suffering. Where do you feel that in the pose? Does it get stuck or lodged? Is there somewhere specific it goes? Maybe your back, your shoulder? Does it spread out? Can you make room for it? Because denying it and closing it off isn't going to help. Two more breaths. Just notice, where does it go? What does it do when you breathe it in? So you'll press down into the right hand, so you can lift your head and shoulders. Roll over onto your left side. And now, instead of the forehead resting on your blanket or block, now it's the side of your head, and just rest on your side for a moment. I like to have my knees bent a little bit. Maybe you want your legs long, though. It's okay. So I'll have you kind of shimmy your whole body a little bit to the left. So the side to which you are currently looking, you're going to slide that way a little bit. Yeah. And then once you've slid almost to the edge of the mat, you're going to roll onto your back. So that's how I'm keeping you on your mat, so you don't end up way off of the right side of your mat. And then make your blanket either much, much thinner or get rid of it altogether. Okay? I don't want your head too high here. Push down into your 2 feet so you can lift your hips just an inch away from the floor and shift them over to the left. So your hips are way to the left. Your knees you draw towards your chest before you tilt your hips and drop them to the right. And then the feet not too close to your butt, because that'll really disrupt the hip rotation. Right hand could rest on that left knee if you'd like. Doesn't have to. And then the left arm is going to open all the way out to the left. Your face turns to the right. So as you breathe in, you acknowledge your own suffering. You recognize that suffering is a universal experience. It is embedded into the fabric of humanity. And as you breathe out with this knowledge, this understanding, this comprehension, breathe out a little bit of support, a little bit of compassion for someone else who is suffering. Maybe they're suffering with the same exact thing. They never have enough hot water for their shower. Maybe it's a group of people. Maybe it's just general. Anyone who is suffering, I will breathe relief and compassion into you. So the inhale is for yourself, for acknowledging your own suffering. And the exhale is for acknowledging the suffering of others, which in itself is a form of compassion. What does it feel like in your body on that exhale to acknowledge the suffering of others? Maybe people you've never even met. So wherever it was, most of us as adults, somewhere along the line, got the idea that our suffering was not acceptable. No one else has time for your suffering. Best thing to do, just suck it up, get over it. The only problem with that is that it doesn't work. What we resist persists. Resistance only amplifies suffering. Acknowledgement softens it. One more breath, please, in your supine twist. And then you're going to roll back to your back. Find the floor with your toes. Come back to your back just briefly, because you're going to shift over to the left a little bit extra so that when you turn onto your belly from your right side, turn to your right side and then to your belly, you will still be on your mat, hopefully, and not way off of the left side of your mat. Come up to your Sphinx pose again with your head toward the front of your mat. And again, make sure that your blanket or your block is present and that if you're using a blanket, it's nice and thick. And then just set that so that it is just barely on the mat with you, just in front of you. And then come to your Sphinx. Maybe your fingers need to go under there or around your blanket. Come to your Sphinx and inhale. Feel the front of your heart lifting up, strong enough to acknowledge and accept your own suffering. And then on your exhale, feel the back of your heart sink, this soft part of you that's able to acknowledge the suffering of others. In the Sphinx pose, the elbows are just slightly forward of the shoulders. If your elbows kind of get buried under you, this pose is really pretty awful. It in itself would be a form of suffering. So if this is really challenging, bring those elbows forward a little bit. I think you'll get a little bit of relief. Enjoy your pose a little bit more. The self-compassion writer and researcher Kristen Neff, who I'm a big fan of, says that there's really 3 big stages to self-compassion. The first is to acknowledge that you're suffering. The second is to acknowledge that suffering is a part of human existence. It exists, even though we don't like it. And this third stage is to resolve to be kind to yourself. Show yourself compassion. This is the last breath here in the Sphinx. Now it's going to get a little bit gnarly. So this is where, for those of you who with tighter shoulders, you might like to have that blanket or bolster under your belly, chest, and hips. Press down again into the left palm, lift the elbow, and then thread the right arm under the left arm, okay? Come on down to that right elbow with your head and shoulders still lifted, and then bring your left arm across so it is over your right arm. So it's chin, left arm, right arm, chest, or boobs, if you've got those. And then for this one, your head might need to be a little bit higher. So maybe you're still using the blanket, or maybe you're going to have the block under your forehead now, because both arms are now crossed. This is a little intense, but it's such a beautiful way to open up the back of the heart. Feel that strong heart of you, acknowledging and taking in your own suffering. So strong it's able to offer support to others who are also suffering. Inhale, acknowledge your own. Exhale, acknowledge the suffering of others. So the fact is, this technique doesn't just work with little stuff, although it's always best to try something initially. Make it a little bit easier for yourself. But anytime you find yourself in a difficult spot, maybe you got an email that really got your heart racing, or the bank account's low, before you do anything else, acknowledge this is a moment of suffering. Suffering is a part of being alive. And resolve to be kind to yourself. I'll have you please lift your head. Bring your arms back to a more neutral position so the elbows are more shoulders width, and return to your Sphinx. Return to your Sphinx pose. Just for a few breaths, and keep it easy on yourself, right? Elbows can be a little bit forward, not buried under you. Head is lifted. This time, breathe into the back of your heart first. And then exhale and lift the front of your heart. Inhale into the back of the heart. Exhale, lift the front of your heart. You are strong enough to acknowledge and accept your own suffering. Two more breaths into this strong, resilient heart. This time the right palm press down, elbow lift, left arm thread under. Keep your head and shoulders lifted, but put the left elbow down briefly. And then thread the right arm under. And then sometimes it's a little tricky getting that block under your forehead because your arms are all tied up, right? So get that block under your forehead. So this time, as you're laying on your belly here, your arms are crossed under you. The order is chin, right arm, left arm, chest. And use this opportunity when the shoulder blades are so beautifully protracted to really explore the back of your heart. Back of your heart is where your strength comes from. In front of your heart is where your softness and compassion comes from. It takes a soft heart and a strong back to practice compassion. To acknowledge your own suffering. One more breath. Just one more breath. Okay, so lift your head. Bring your elbows out wide again, about shoulder's width. You can leave your block and your blanket in front unless you'd like to use them for one more child's pose. So once again, come back to your elbows and your knees. Knees are going to be about as wide as your mat, and your big toes are together. Use the strength of those arms to push your rear end back. And then if your butt still is pretty high and you're feeling jammed forward, stack up your arms so that you can rest your head a little bit higher away from the floor. But if your forehead comes easily to the ground, you can stretch your arms out. For this child's pose, just find your preferred arm position. I kind of like to have my elbows wide and my hands together. So maybe one hand stacked on the other. That's my preference. I am breathing in. I am breathing out. Now please press down into the arms again and help yourself forward to elbows and knees. Walk both knees to one side and the elbows as well, so that you can come down to your hip and flip over onto your back. And then once you're on your back, if you'd like to rest your head once again on your blanket, I fully advocate for that. Stretch those legs out long so your heels are about as wide as your mat, your toes flopped out to the sides. Arms can either open out to the sides, or maybe you would feel best just having your hands on you for this Shavasana. It's your choice. And notice how your body feels now. After taking the time to release not your suffering, but your resistance to your suffering. What does it feel like to breathe? And from your toes, slowly all the way up your legs, all the way up the torso, down the arms, up to the head. Just take a scan. Just notice how you feel. Not looking for anything specific. Just notice how you feel. And then even that noticing is now too much work. Let that go. Allow the body to sink into the mat. The breath to return to spontaneous tempo. The mind to simply fall back for your Shavasana. It's time now to deepen the breath. Time to restore movement to the body. When you're ready, find your way onto the side of your choice and rest there. Roll into your hands. Help yourself up to your seat, any kind of seated position. Just for a couple of breaths. As you breathe in, say your mantra, I am breathing in. As you breathe out, I am breathing out. How does your heart feel? Back of your heart and front of it. I am breathing in. I am breathing out. Press your palms together in front of your heart. Bow your head. Thank you so much for sharing your practice with me today. Namaste.